Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world. I'm really excited about today's deep dive because we are going to try a little experiment right out of the gate.
Oh, an experiment. Okay.
Yeah, so I want you, the listener, to visualize a map of the United States. Now, obviously, unless you're driving, in which case, please keep your eyes on the road and just visualize with your mind's eye. But for everyone else, just close your eyes for a second. Picture that map.
I think most people, they see the outline first, the distinct shape of the continent.
Right.
Florida hanging down at the bottom right, Texas doing its big thing at the bottom center, Maine sticking up in the top corner like a thumb.
Exactly. You see the jagged coasts. You see the Mississippi River winding down the middle of it all like a snake. But then, and this is the important part, look at the interior. Look at the West. What do you actually see?
Well, you see geometry. You just see boxes.
Yes. You see this massive rectangular grid. Wyoming is a perfect box. Colorado is a box. The Dakotas are stacked on top of each other like bricks. And if you're like most people, you probably grew up thinking that this map is just, well, geography, that it's a literal picture of the land itself.
And that right there is the fundamental error. That is exactly where we run into what we're calling today a crisis in perception.
A crisis in perception. Which, it sounds a little dramatic, almost like a psychological thriller or something.
It does.
But it's actually a very practical issue regarding how we understand our own country. We look at a map and we think we are seeing the physical, natural world.
Yeah.
But we aren't.
No, absolutely not. You are looking at a diagram of political governance technology.
Governance technology, that's the phrase that really stuck with me from our research this week.
Yeah.
It implies that a state line isn't just a boundary where, the pavement changes color on the highway. It's a tool.
It is a piece of engineered infrastructure. Every single line on that map, especially those straight geometric ones, was designed to control specific things. We're talking about the balance of power in the U.S. Senate, access to global markets via waterways, the flow of capital, and inevitably the containment or expansion of slavery.
So the map is actually a blueprint of political conflict.
Precisely. It's a fossil record of deals, arguments, and power grabs, mostly from the 19th century. And to help us decode this blueprint, we're doing a deep dive into a really fascinating book by Mark Stein called How the States Got Their Shapes Too, The People Behind the Borderlines.
Now, I know you might be thinking, history of maps, is this going to be totally dry? Are we just talking about guys in powdered wigs with compasses?
Right, surveying equipment.
Exactly. But having spent the last few days completely immersed in this material, I can promise you it is the exact opposite of dry. It's full of petty feuds, railroad tycoons, secret treaties, and accidentally misplaced borders that are causing actual water wars right now, today.
Yeah, Stein takes a biographical approach in the book. He tells the stories of the specific individuals, some famous, some super obscure, who actually held the pen and made the decisions. But our mission for this deep dive is to take those stories and sort of peel back the layer of biography to reveal the hidden system underneath it all.
Right, the incentive architecture. We want to prove that borders aren't natural. They are stabilized outcomes of conflict. And honestly, once you see the machinery behind the map, you really can't unsee it. It changes how you look at a globe forever.
That's the goal. We want to understand how land, labor, and sovereignty were converted into these enforceable lines.
So let's get into the design phase. If we're arguing that the map is a design system, we have to start with the architect, the guy who loved designing things, whether it was his house at Monticello or the entire American West, more than anyone else.
Thomas Jefferson. We have to start with Jefferson, because long before the United States had any real administrative control over the continent, Jefferson had a vision for what it should look like. We're going back to 1784.
Set the scene for us a bit. The Revolutionary War is over. We have this massive amount of land west of the Appalachians, what we now call the Midwest, and nobody really knows what to do with it.
It's a blank canvas. And Jefferson, being a creature of the Enlightenment, he absolutely hates chaos. He looks at the map of the original colonies, Virginia, Massachusetts, the Carolinas, and he just sees a mess.
Of a total mess.
They are all different sizes, different shapes. Their borders are these squiggly lines following rivers or mountain ridges. It's organic, but to him, it's messy. It's irrational.
And Jefferson wanted order. He wanted the map to look like pure logic.
He wanted rational equality. So he proposes a plan for the Western territories that is shockingly geometric. He wanted to slice the territory into states that were exactly 2 degrees of latitude high,
Just stack them up.
like layers of a cake. He wanted to drop a graph paper grid over the continent. The idea was that for a democracy to function properly, the units of that democracy, the states, needed to be roughly equivalent in power and potential.
That's a very engineer way to solve a political problem. If everyone has the exact same amount of land, everyone is equal.
In theory, yes. He even went so far as to name them. And I know you saw this in the notes. The names he came up with are incredible. They aren't just, North Virginia or West Carolina.
They are wild. They sound like places in a fantasy novel written by a Roman senator.
They are magnificent examples of classical idealism clashing with the gritty American frontier. He proposed names like Metropotamia, which translates to Mother of Rivers. He also suggested Polypotamia, Michigania, Asenacypia, and Illinois.
Okay, Asenacypia sounds like something you'd need a prescription cream to treat. Like, I'm sorry, you have a bad case of Asenacypia.
It really does. But the point wasn't just the funny names. It was the hundred system. Jefferson wanted to divide land into hundreds, basically squares that were 10 geographical miles on each side, and then those would be subdivided into smaller lots.
And this is where we get the crisis in perception starting to clear up. Because even though we didn't keep the names, we aren't broadcasting from the great state of Polypotamia, we kept the geometry. If you fly over Kansas or Iowa today, what do you see?
You see the grid. You see Jefferson's literal imprint on the earth. The roads meet at perfect right angles. The farm fields are squares. Compare that to the East Coast. If you drive around Boston or Virginia, the roads wind around hills and creeks. They follow the land.
Right.
But the Midwest, it is a manufactured landscape. It is the physical imposition of an idea onto the earth.
It's an imposition of order onto nature. But here is the snag in the plan. Jefferson wanted all these states to be small and equal. But looking at the map today, we don't have a bunch of identical small states. We have some huge ones, some medium ones. What happened to the equal grid plan?
The system happened.
Right.
Specifically, the Senate happened.
Okay, this is a crucial pivot point.
Yeah.
How does the U.S. Senate, a legislative body, physically change the shape of the land?
It all comes down to power dynamics. Jefferson's plan for the Northwest Territory, which is what became Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and so on, was eventually overhauled. James Monroe and Congress got involved, and they realized that Jefferson's small equal states idea was actually politically dangerous for them.
Dangerous how? Wouldn't more states be better for democracy?
Not if you're an existing state protecting your own influence. This is the first major aha moment in understanding borders. Congress realized that the size of a state determines how many states you can fit in a territory.
Simple division. Big states equals fewer states. Small states equals more states.
And the number of states determines the number of senators.
2 per state, regardless of population. That is the immutable math of the Constitution.
Exactly. There was a fascinating argument from an Ohio congressman named Samuel Vinton. Now, this is a bit later, during the debate over Iowa's borders, but it perfectly encapsulates the logic of the entire era. Vinton looked at the map and did the math. He realized that the Atlantic states, the original power brokers, were relatively small.
All right, Delaware is tiny. Rhode Island is a speck. Even Maryland isn't huge.
Vinton argued that if the West was divided into massive states, say 160,000 square miles each, there might only be a few of them. That means the West would have very few votes in the Senate compared to the East. The West would be a permanent political minority.
So Vinton actually argued for smaller states in the West.
He argued that breaking the territory into more states, which inherently meant smaller borders, would create more Senate seats for the region. It was strictly about creating a counterbalance to the power of the Atlantic states. He basically said, we need to chop this land up finely so we have enough voices in Washington to stop the East Coast from dominating us.
That is a cynical but honestly brilliant calculation. So the shape of Iowa, or the shape of Ohio, isn't about what makes sense for the farmers living there. It isn't about watershed management or geography. It's about ensuring there are enough votes in Washington, D.C. to counteract Massachusetts and Virginia.
Precisely. The border isn't for the people living inside it. It's for the people counting votes outside of it. That is the very essence of political infrastructure.
So we moved from Jefferson's idealism that everyone should be geometrically equal to raw political calculus. How do we maximize our Senate leverage?
And that calculus didn't just determine size, it determined orientation. Which brings us to one of the most glaring examples of governance technology on the map, and that's Illinois.
Illinois, I'm looking at it in my mind right now. It's tall. It looks like a connection piece.
It is tall, and if you look at the bottom, it's wedged right down between the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. That's the deep south. Geographically speaking, it sticks way down there. But look at the top. It has that flat northern border that cuts across Lake Michigan, giving it Chicago.
Right. Seems normal. Chicago is in Illinois. That's just a basic fact of life.
Except it wasn't supposed to be there. Under the original Northwest Ordinance, the northern border of Illinois was supposed to be a straight line drawn exactly from the southern tip of Lake Michigan.
Wait, if the line was at the southern tip, then Illinois wouldn't have any lakefront.
Zero. No
Yeah.
Chicago, no port, no connection to the Great Lakes whatsoever.
So Illinois would have just been a river state.
It would have been entirely a Mississippi River state. And think about what that means for the economy of 1818. If you lived in central Illinois, how did you sell your corn? There are no railroads yet.
You put it on a barge. You float it down the river
Beware.
to New Orleans.
Exactly. So your economy is completely tied to New Orleans. Your
Yeah.
commerce, your culture, your banking relationships were all Southern. And this is where we meet Nathaniel Pope.
Daniel Pope. Who is he?
He was Illinois' territorial delegate to Congress. And in 1818, he did something that arguably saved the United States 40 years later. He lobbied to move that northern border north by about 60 miles.
Just, hey, give us 60 more miles.
Essentially. But his argument wasn't just a greedy, we want more land pitch. It was a brilliant systemic argument about what he called the perpetuity of the Union.
How does moving a line 60 miles save the Union?
Pope was looking at the future. He knew about the Erie Canal, which was being advocated by guys like Jesse Hawley over in New York. The Erie Canal was going to connect the Atlantic Ocean, specifically New York City, to the Great Lakes.
Okay, so that opens up a massive new trade route.
Pope realized if I can get Illinois a port on Lake Michigan, which is what became Chicago, then Illinois farmers can ship their goods north and east through the Great Lakes and the canal, instead of just south down the river.
So instead of being solely dependent on the South, they become economically tied to the North as well.
Correct. Pope argued that by moving the border up to include a small waterway called the Chicago River, Illinois would become the keystone of the Union. It would have 1 foot in the river system facing south and 1 foot in the lake system facing north.
It physically prevents the state from becoming a purely Southern sympathizer.
And it worked incredibly well. Think about the Civil War. When the war came, Illinois, the land of Lincoln, stayed with the Union. If that border hadn't been moved, if Chicago had been up in Wisconsin, Illinois might very well have seceded. Its economic interests would have been almost entirely with the Confederacy.
That honestly gives me chills. A 60-mile shift in a line on a map literally determined the stability of the United States.
That is the crisis in perception. We think that line is just where the toll booth goes. In reality, it was a deliberate piece of infrastructure of loyalty. It was designed to bind the nation together against the threat of civil war.
Infrastructure of loyalty. That is such a powerful concept and implies that you can engineer patriotism or at least economic allegiance by routing trade.
Absolutely. The Erie Canal wasn't just a ditch. It was, as the North American Review called it back in 1822, a chain to bind the Union. And Illinois was the lock on that chain.
So we've got Senate math determining the size of states, and we've got waterway loyalty determining their shape. But sometimes when I look at the map, I see things that don't look like grand national strategy. They look like glitches. Like, if you ever really look at Missouri,
The boot here.
the boot heel, there's that little square tab that just hangs off the southeast corner of Missouri, digging straight down into Arkansas. It looks like a mistake, like the surveyor sneezed or the pen slipped.
It really does look like a glitch. But in systems thinking, there are no glitches, only incentives. And the incentive here had a name, John Hardiman Walker.
Who was John Hardiman Walker?
He was a cattle rancher, a very, very powerful man. They called him the Czar of the Valley. He owned a massive amount of land in that little corner right between the St. Francis and Mississippi rivers.
Okay, so he owns the land. Why does he care where the line is drawn? I mean, his grass is still his grass.
Because of where the power was. At that time, Missouri, specifically St. Louis, was the hub of civilization in that region. It was commerce, banking, politics, river trade. Arkansas. Arkansas was considered a complete backwater. It was just unorganized territory.
So he didn't want to be the biggest fish in a small, unorganized pond.
He wanted his property values and his legal standing to be tied to the winner. He wanted to be a Missourian. But the original border was supposed to just follow the 3630 line straight across. That would have cut him off completely, would have left him stuck in Arkansas.
So he just asked them to change it.
He used his influence, he lobbied hard, and he got the federal government to literally drop the line down, specifically to scoop up his cattle ranches and include them in Missouri.
That is incredible. A state border looks like that because one single guy wanted to be in the cool state.
But again, look deeper. It wasn't just vanity. It was about law, specifically slave law. Missouri was entering as a state with very specific protections for slavery. By ensuring his land was in Missouri, Walker was securing his assets, his human property, under a specific legal regime that favored him.
Wow. That adds a much darker layer to it. It's a feedback loop. The line determines the law determines the value of the land and the labor, so the powerful landowner changes the line to lock in the law.
Exactly. And this idea of personal ambition scaling up to dictate national geography brings us to perhaps the most cynical mapmaker of them all, Stephen A. Douglas.
The Little Giant, Abraham Lincoln's famous rival.
The very same. Now, Douglas is responsible for a lot of the map in the middle of the country, but let's look at two specific anomalies: the shapes of Kansas and Nebraska and the existence of the Oklahoma Panhandle.
The Oklahoma Panhandle is that long, thin strip of land just sitting above Texas. I've always wondered why Texas didn't just go all the way up and claim it.
Well, that part is actually another slavery story. Texas cut off its own top because slavery was prohibited above the 3630 line by the Missouri Compromise. They wanted to keep their slaves, so they essentially decapitated their own state to stay south of the line.
Okay, so Texas retreats to keep its labor system.
Oh.
But that leaves a gap.
It leaves a gap. But the exact shape of that gap is defined by Stephen Douglas.
How does Douglas fit into the Panhandle?
So Stephen Douglas desperately wants to be president, and he wants a transcontinental railroad. And he wants that railroad to start in Chicago. Remember Nathaniel Polk's port? Douglas represents Illinois. He wants all the wealth of the West to flow straight through Chicago.
It all connects. Pope gets the port. Douglas wants the train to go to the port.
Exactly. But to get the railroad to California, it has to pass through the territories west of Missouri. And at that time, that land was Indian territory. It was guaranteed to Native American tribes by treaties. You couldn't just build a railroad through it legally.
So he needed to organize it into states or territories to basically invalidate the treaties.
Correct. He needed to extinguish the Indian titles to the land. This is the really dark side of the governance technology. He creates the Kansas-Nebraska Act to organize the area. Now, look at the border between Kansas and Oklahoma. It sits at the 37th parallel.
Wait, why 37? The Missouri Compromise line, the line Texas stopped at, was 3630. Why move it up half a degree?
Douglas claimed publicly that it was to avoid dividing the Cherokee territory. He used this noble humanitarian excuse. Oh, we can't possibly split the tribal lands.
But knowing Douglas,
that was complete nonsense. The real goal was to create a clean slate for the railroad and to organize the territories in a way that balanced the slavery issue just enough to get him Southern votes for his presidential run. So he shifted the Kansas border to 37 degrees.
And that shift is what left a narrow strip of land between Kansas at 37 and Texas at 3630. A literal no man's land.
Which eventually became the Oklahoma Panhandle. It's a physical scar left on the map by a railroad lobbyist breaking treaties.
But look at the geometric outcome of that. By setting Kansas's southern border at 37 degrees, Douglas created a brand new baseline for the map.
Yes. If you look at the map today, Kansas is exactly 3 degrees of latitude high. Nebraska, right above it, 3 degrees high. The Dakotas, 3 degrees high.
It's the stack again. We're back to Jefferson.
It's a return to the Jeffersonian box system. But this time it wasn't born of Enlightenment idealism or equality. It was born of deep cynicism. Douglas needed to churn out territories quickly to clear the path for the train. So they just stamped them out like cookies. 3 degrees, 3 degrees, 3 degrees.
And then the mountains.
Then the mountain states, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, they are stacked right next to them, but they are 4 degrees high.
Why 4 for them?
Likely because the land was considered less valuable, much more rugged. You needed more of it to make a viable state economy. But the core point is, Douglas's ambition to build a railroad to Chicago dictated the height of North Dakota.
It's amazing. We think of these shapes as just how it is. But they are fossils of 19th century political schemes.
Fossils of schemes is a great way to put it. But sometimes, the schemes fail. Or, rather, the map fights back.
This brings us to the persistence of conflict. Because I assume that once you draw a line, the fight is over, right? The law is settled.
Oh, absolutely not. Sometimes the line itself becomes the source of a whole new conflict. Let's talk about the Georgia-Tennessee water war.
This is the one that's active right now, isn't it?
It is one of my favorite examples of a zombie border, a mistake from 1818 that is literally haunting us today.
So set the scene for this water war.
It's 1818 again. A surveyor is hired to draw the border between Georgia and Tennessee. The law clearly states the border should be at the 35th parallel.
Okay, simple astronomy. Look at the stars, find the line, draw the map.
In theory. But the surveyor missed. He was using primitive equipment. Maybe it was tired. Maybe the math was just off. He marked the border about 1 mile south of the actual 35th parallel.
1 mile? That doesn't seem like much in the grand scheme of things.
It's huge if that 1 mile contains the Tennessee River.
Ah, the water.
If the line had been drawn correctly at the 35th parallel, Georgia would have a tiny slice of the Tennessee River within its borders. They would have riparian rights. They could stick a pipe in it and drink.
But because the surveyor marked it 1 mile south,
The border sits on completely dry land. Tennessee gets the whole river.
and for a long time nobody cared.
Right, until 2007. And continuing today, Atlanta is exploding in population. Georgia is facing massive droughts. They are running out of water. So the Georgia legislature looks at the map, looks at the original law, and says, hey, wait a minute. The law says the border is the 35th parallel. The river is at the 35th parallel. That water is legally ours.
They want a do-over.
They want to correct the survey to match the original legislation. But Tennessee says absolutely not.
On what grounds? I mean, if the map is wrong based on the law, isn't it just wrong?
Enter the legal concept of adverse possession.
Squatters' rights.
Basically, yes, but for states. Tennessee argues, look, we've governed this land for 200 years. We've collected taxes here. We've arrested people here. We've paved roads here. The line might have been a mistake originally, but history has hardened it into fact.
That is the crisis in perception in a nutshell. The mistake became the reality. The infrastructure was built on a typo.
And the courts generally side with stability over accuracy. This is a crucial systems insight. Once a piece of governance technology is installed, once the border is drawn, institutions settle around it immediately. Identities form. People say, I am a Tennessean. You can't just move the line back because the surveyor had a bad day in 1818. The infrastructure has set like concrete.
So Georgia is thirsty today because of a math error from the era of muskets.
Correct. And because the legal system values certainty more than it values truth.
That's a really heavy thought. The system values certainty more than truth. Let's zoom out a bit. We've been talking mostly about lines between states. But what about the lines that define the whole nation?
The international systems. This is where the abstraction gets even wilder.
The 49th parallel, the longest straight border in the world, between the U.S. and Canada.
It's the ultimate abstraction. It ignores mountains, it ignores lakes, indigenous territories, watersheds. It just slashes a straight geometric line right across the continent.
Who drew it, and why straight?
Richard Rush. He was the American diplomat negotiating with Britain in 1818. They didn't know what was out there. They barely understood the geography of the West. But they knew one thing for sure. Britain wanted access to the Mississippi River.
The British wanted to be able to sail down the Mississippi all the way from Canada.
Yes. They thought the Mississippi headwaters were way further north than they actually are. Rush's main goal was to block them. He wanted the U.S. to have total, undisputed control of the Mississippi.
So he offered the 49th parallel as a compromise.
He traded the line for the river. He basically said, we'll agree to this arbitrary latitude line as the border if you give up your claim to navigate the Mississippi.
He traded geometry for hydrography.
And it worked. The British accepted the line. But notice the incentive here. The shape of the northern U.S. isn't based on where the people lived or where the mountains provided a natural defense. It was a strategic block against a geopolitical rival.
It's like a giant game of rifts. You're placing pieces to block the opponent's movement. And speaking of blocks, we really can't talk about U.S. borders without talking about the biggest line of all, the one that isn't there anymore, but also kind of is, the Missouri Compromise line.
3630, the line on slavery.
This feels like the most tragic example of borders as governance technology.
It is. The U.S. was tearing itself apart over the issue of slavery. They couldn't resolve the moral issue, or rather, the South wouldn't relinquish the institution of slavery, so Congress tried to resolve it with cartography.
They tried to contain it.
They drew a line at 3630 across the Western territories. North of the line, free. South of the line, slave. They tried to build a literal dam against slavery using a line of latitude.
But the dam broke.
It broke because of the Mexican War. Suddenly we acquired Texas, California, New Mexico. California is huge. It crosses the line. Texas is huge. The geometry couldn't contain the conflict anymore. You simply can't solve a systemic, moral, and economic rot with a ruler.
And yet they kept trying to use maps to solve conflicts, which leads to that fascinating story about Maine. This is the cartographic blackmail story.
Oh, the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. This is classic deep state maneuvering. So there was a bitter dispute over where the border between Maine and Canada actually was. It almost led to a war. They called it the Aroostook War.
Was that the one with lumberjacks fighting each other?
Basically, yes. Daniel Webster, the U.S. Secretary of State, wanted to settle it. He desperately wanted to avoid a real war with Britain. But the people of Maine were furious. They didn't want to give up an inch of land.
So what did Webster do?
He found some old maps, one supposedly drawn by Benjamin Franklin and one from a French archive. These maps had red lines on them that actually seemed to support the British claim over the American one.
Wait, the American Secretary of State found maps that helped the British?
Yes, but he didn't show them to the British. He showed them secretly to the leaders of Maine. He basically said, look, I found these maps. They prove you guys have no case. If we go to arbitration or war and these maps come out, you're going to lose everything. So you better accept this compromise right now.
He bluffed his own side.
He absolutely did. He used fake news or at least highly dubious maps to scare Maine into accepting a border that favored peace. It was cartographic blackmail, and it successfully avoided a war.
That is wild. The shape of Maine is defined by a diplomatic bluff against its own citizens.
It shows that borders are often settled not by historical truth or geography, but by the urgent need to stop fighting.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, literally. We've got Jefferson's Grid, Pope's Canal, the Senate Math, the cattle rancher's boot heel, the railroad lobbyist's panhandle, and the water wars.
We have. It's a lot of lines.
So let's answer the explicit question for the listener. What is the actual crisis in perception here? When I look at the map now, what should I be seeing?
You should stop seeing states as fixed, historical, almost natural entities. You should stop thinking that the shapes are trivial or accidental.
Okay. So what are they?
They are incentive architecture.
Incentive architecture. Break that down for us one more time.
Every line is a scar left by a battle over an incentive. Illinois is tall because the incentive was union preservation and access to northern markets. The Dakotas are split into two because the incentive was Senate votes doubling the representation for that specific political faction.
And the Oklahoma Panhandle is there because the incentive was railroad routing and extinguishing Indian treaties.
Exactly. And Georgia is thirsty because the legal system values stability adverse possession over cartographic accuracy.
So the map is a record of what powerful people wanted at the exact moment the concrete poured.
It's a snapshot of the power dynamics of 1818 or 1850 or 1864. And the crisis is that we treat these lines as sacred geography today. We let them dictate our water rights, our school curriculums, our electoral college logic, as if they were ordained by nature. But they were just drawn by guys like Nathaniel Pope and Stephen Douglas trying to close a deal.
That is a profound shift. It makes the map feel malleable, or at least understandable. It's not a mystery, it's just politics frozen in time.
Politics frozen in time, I like that. And I think the final takeaway is that systems persist. We are still living in Jefferson's grid. We are still voting in Vinton's Senate structure. We are still drinking or not drinking from the river based on that surveyor's error. The lines are invisible, but the walls they create are very, very real.
Well, I will never look at a map of the U.S. the same way again, especially that little tab on Missouri.
The boot heel will get you every time.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.